I made a video called 15 years of photography advice in 15 minutes previously, and it was really popular, and I think it helped a lot of people. So here is the companion piece. It's slightly less sexy, but still fun. 15 years of photo editing advice in 15 minutes. Hopefully less. I'll be showcasing some of my best tips on both Adobe Lightroom and Luminar Neo, who are the kind sponsor of today's video, but all of these tips and tricks are relatively generic and should be available to do on whatever software that you use. Part 1. Think about your images as layers. If you start editing an image globally, say you want to make your subject brighter, but you just use the exposure and bring everything up, sometimes the results are not what you want. If you start thinking about your image in terms of different layers, whether that's the subject, the sky, the foreground, whatever it may be, if we start breaking things down piece by piece and attacking the edit on that level, then you'll get a much stronger image overall. So this puffin photo, for example, it was a pain in the backside with puffins. If you've ever shot puffins, you'll know what I mean. Because they're very bright and contrasty because they're black and white, it's very hard to pull out the detail of the black bits without overexposing the white bits. So attacking this on a layered system works wonders. And sometimes I think it looks quite nice to bring the background down around the subject like I did in this wolf photo, but I think for the puffins, making everything light and bright really helps enhance the scene. Another great tip is your photo editing is an extension of your composition. So when we think about composing an image, we're talking about making our subjects stand out, right? So there's plenty of ways that you can do that in your composition, whether that's contrast, sharpness, whether that's color contrast, whether that's leading lines, whatever it may be, you want your subject to be the star of the show. And then if you hand that over to the editing process and just enhance your subject in the same way. So that could be creating a mask around your subject and making your subject a little bit sharper and then making everything else a little bit softer. Perhaps making your subject a little bit more colourful and everything else slightly less colourful to really draw in the eye. It doesn't have to be big, bold strokes in this technique. I mean, that could make things look terrible, so it must be a subtle approach. But the human eye loves sharpness, contrast, brightness. It loves human faces as well. So we're naturally drawn to these things. So if you make your subject enhanced in any of those ways, then our little lizard brain will go, "Oh, that's a subject, that's cool." And then your photo will start to tell the story that you want it to tell. In this first example, I had a radial mask in the middle, and then I made that bit brighter and everything else darker. In this second image, the lighting and the shadows was already there, as you can see. I just emphasized what was already there by making the middle bit warmer and brighter and the outside darker and cooler for contrast. With these people jumping, it was quite a messy scene, so I isolated them as subjects and added clarity to them, inverted the mask and made everything else that little bit softer. Here's a good one. I'm very guilty of this in the past. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. I think a lot of modern photos have this HDR look where you might be inclined to ramp up the shadows and pull down the highlights and get all of the detail in as much as you can. And I think that's really, one, not true to life, and two, I think the contrast and shadows and concealing elements of a scene in order to make another part stand out is what photography is all about. We're painting with light. So just because you can have all this dynamic range in the world in these fancy raw files doesn't mean we should. In fact, I would urge you to go in the opposite direction and pull your shadows down. Remove distractions by having dark parts in your scene, because if there are dark negative spaces within your scene, it only makes the brighter bits more appealing to look at. This is one for portraits and wedding photographers, but also applicable to everyone. If there is a human being in your photo, skin tones must be your number one priority. Another thing that the human eye is very attuned to is if skin tones look off. And if you put on a preset that's designed for landscapes, for example, it may push and pull the hues within the skin tone range into a bonkers thing that doesn't look real. This is why with my own presets, I have a pack for landscapes, a pack for cityscapes, and a pack that really caters to skin tones, because you have to get that bit relatively true to life, or you will just know that something's not right with the scene. Here is my handy dandy trick of just litmus testing this. Zoom in onto the skin tones in particular and stick your before and after on. Now, I'm not saying it needs to match the before because you might want to make the scene a little bit warmer, for example, but it's a good sort of rule of thumb to be like, this is what it looked like in real life. I can maybe push it in this direction or this direction a little bit. Anything more than that's going to look bonkers. And we do this with the hue, saturation, and luminance sliders. This way, just double check that your skin tones are correct, and then when you zoom out, your image will look better overall. One thing I see some beginners do in their edit, particularly if we have a lot of interesting textures, like if it's an architecture shot or a landscape shot, is abusing, really, the clarity slider and also the texture slider. Both of these, as my general rule of thumb, globally, I never ramp up. If anything, I'll tone it down because most cameras, even slightly older cameras, are plenty sharp enough, and softening these things a little bit can actually make the image nicer and more pleasing to look at. What you should use with these is, as we were talking about before when thinking about layers, is don't apply it to the whole blooming image, apply it to the bits that matter. So for example, if we have a seascape and you want the rocks that are wet to just really pop and draw the eye, stick a mask over them and just add clarity there, because as I mentioned before, the human eye likes clarity and it will see that bit and go, oh, that's nice, that the eye journey through the scene starts here. If you do it on the whole blooming image, it just becomes overwhelming and a little bit amateurish. Only caveat to that is if you really stylize portraiture and you whack up the clarity, as some people like to do. It's not my style, but I have seen it work very well. And I suppose all of these things are just sort of things that I like to do in my particular style. They're not hard and fast rules. There are no rules in photography. One video that I also did recently was a Lightroom alternative video, because Adobe have put up the monthly and annual subscriptions recently for Lightroom and Photoshop, and some people are unhappy about it and some people just hate paying monthly for stuff in general, which is why I thought a great sponsor for this video would be Luminar. They have a pay monthly option, but they also have a buy it once and own it forever option, which I find really appealing. And hopefully in this video, as you've seen on both softwares, that it does do a heck of a lot that Lightroom can do. And depending on your needs, it might be ideal and you could drop that monthly subscription to Lightroom and use Luminar instead. One thing that I really like Luminar for is a effect called the autumn effect, and I'll show you. So if you want to have like really bloomed lights at night, this feature in Luminar does it so much better than what you can achieve in Lightroom. You just need to mask the bit that you want and then add in the effect to taste. The closest thing that you can do in Lightroom to achieve that is maybe use the dehaze slider, but it doesn't look nearly as good. Luminar have also brought out a phone app as well, and it's super cool. In terms of like how it works, it's really cleverly designed for touch, so you can edit in a very tactile, interesting way on your phone, and there's some really nice presets built in as well. So definitely check out Luminar if you're looking to buy once and never pay monthly again. I have a cheeky discount code in the description, and let's get back to more editing tips. And a top tip for sharpening, again, is we never want to do it globally, because all the bits that are out of focus, if you've used like a shallower depth of field, you don't want those bits sharp. So what you need to do is Alt, then you can just ramp up the sharpness and just see exactly what you're affecting. And this is a great way to apply sharpness without over sharpening the whole blooming thing. So here is a running joke currently in the wedding industry, is that a lot of editing choices in the last couple of years have made it look like grass is dying because a lot of edits come with muted greens. Now personally, this is a hill I will die on. I quite like the look of it. I think having really bold, oversaturated greens and blues and purples, in my opinion, can sometimes be bad. So when you start editing your photographs and learning more about your own style, you will find colours that you irrationally hate, and also colours that you are really drawn to. So using my style as an example, I don't really like greens, I don't really like big, bold blues, and I really don't like purple. Conversely, I love warmer tones like oranges and yellows, and if we must have blue, I tend to roll it to teal. Hashtag orange and teal. But I do it subtly, I promise. So once you've found your own style and the colours that you want to emphasise, you can use your hue, saturation and luminance sliders to really bring your vision to life. So oftentimes you will see in my images, for example, I'll probably almost completely desaturate the purples. I find them quite distracting. And top tip, if you are shooting with an older camera, a lot of colour noise manifests as purple. So if you desaturate the purple, you can actually make the image look cleaner. That's years and years and years of using really old cameras. I also personally sometimes find big, bold blue skies to be quite distracting. So I might desaturate the blue a little bit, or I might tweak it so it's a little bit more teal. But this is just a stylistic choice. This is not like a rule by any stretch. You can get really cool, iconic photos with big blue skies. It's just down to your personal preference. To take this image as an example, there was originally a little bit of blue in the sky. Because, as I mentioned, you know that humans are drawn to colours in an otherwise desaturated image, I thought an effective way to edit this image would be to take the blue out of the sky entirely so it isn't a distraction, because I want everyone's eye to be near the water. So I've left the blue or the green in the water, and because that's the most colourful part of the image, that's where your eye naturally goes. Another way, if you have nailed down the colours that you want to emphasise in your image, outside of the hue, saturation and luminance sliders, is using the calibration tools in Lightroom. Now this was just a corrective tool to begin with. It's literally changing the colour information at the raw level. So if you want your reds to look a bit more orange, that's how Lightroom will interpret them. Of course, because we're working in a digital space, we can use it creatively as well. So particularly for nightscapes, I find the calibration can sometimes be a little bit more easier to wrangle than the hue sliders. One thing I've learned as a very lazy YouTuber is that you can use masks to add in fake lighting into your images. I'm going to show you a thumbnail and also an actual landscape, so it can be applicable to people that don't do this weird thing for a living. For example, in the thumbnail, if I want to emphasize my subject or the object, I will mask around myself and then add in a layer of light behind it. And that way you can get some really nice fake lighting that draws the eye of the viewer to where you want it to be. Don't really want people looking at me, want people looking at the cool shiny camera. In a landscape like this, where I have a little bit of natural light coming into the side of the scene, I could add on a radial layer and then warm up that light and maybe roll down the dehaze to make it look bloomy and ethereal, and really just emphasize what was already there in the image, but just make it a little bit cooler. Well, warmer. You know what I mean? I think a great rule of thumb when it comes to editing is really trying to emphasize what is already present in the composition. If we try and relight a scene in a way that's just completely artificial, people will see that a mile off, and I don't like that. But if you do have a bit of flair in your image already, then emphasizing it is just honing the image. It's not cheating, it's not creating something from nothing, it's just working with what you've got and making it look more pronounced. One tip for displaying your images is check and reference your images where they're going to be seen. So for example, if you're printing out your work, do a little print first to make sure that the colours that you see on your screen translate to print. Also, obviously, calibrate your monitor if you need to as well. However, I think for the majority of us, myself included, so much of my work is going to be seen on blooming Instagram, for example, or in a YouTube video. So I send the images to my phone and see what they look like. Now you'll see on phones that most of them are OLED screens, so blacks can be more crunchy on a phone, and certainly in Samsung phones the colours will be a little bit more saturated as well. So sometimes you might want to tone it down a bit in the edit, knowing that the phone will boost it. Just check where the images are going to be mostly viewed and then edit accordingly. There's no point having an image look wonderful on your really expensive calibrated monitor, but then when you get it on Instagram, it looks washed out, for example. So there are just some of my nerdy tips for your editing journey. If you did find this useful, make sure to subscribe to my mailing list. I am working on some dedicated editing workshops, and I promise I will get them out at some point before we all die of old age. I meant to get these out in like March, but you know, life got in the way. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did and would like some more inspiration, check out my 15 years of photography advice in 15 minutes. And with these powers combined, you will be leveling up your photography skills in no time at all.